Welcome to the Story of Everything, Session 3. Up to this point in the Story of Everything, we've talked about the nature of God and how God exists in a community of grace we call the Trinity. Because God's people are created in God's image, they're also wired up for living in a community of grace. In the last session, we talked about how sin is what went wrong in the Story of Everything. Hopefully, as a group, you had an opportunity to explore how the effects and the consequences of sin in our world today are primarily relational in nature. Sin destroys the community of grace that God desires for us. Well, all this is important to understand because in this session, we want to explore God's desire to restore His dream for the world. God had a plan from the very beginning of time about how He would need to restore the world from the effects of sin. Now, it's important for us to understand that Jesus was not just a response to sin. You might remember that in the previous session, we talked about how grace always comes first, and that grace existed long before sin ever did. The story of Jesus goes back to that original community of grace that existed before anything was created. The Son of God existed long before sin ever entered the story. The Bible puts it this way in John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. And one of the last things recorded in the Bible is Jesus declaring to be the first, the last, the beginning, and the end. So, from Genesis to Revelation, 66 books of the Bible, everything points to Jesus. John also writes that Jesus did many other things. And if every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. So Jesus is pretty important. In fact, He is the pinnacle of the story of everything. This should be a pretty important session for your small group. Now there's three main concepts that we really hope your group understands by the time you end your discussion. And as you spend time in the Bible during the session, we want to point you to Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11. In these few short verses, we get a glimpse of three of the most critical aspects of the story of Jesus that we need to remember. The first is the idea of the incarnation. This is the idea that Jesus is with us. God literally writes Himself into the story of everything in a physical way. He sends His Son Jesus to live amongst us and become familiar with everything that it means to be human in nature. Motivated out of His love for people, God emptied Himself, became a human being and a servant. He desired to be with us. And He is with us to bring us back into the community of grace. And because He's with us, He understands what we go through. So that's the first concept. The next main concept in the story of Jesus is what most of us have maybe heard the most about: Jesus dying on the cross. Theologians call this atonement. Now, that word atonement is a fancy word that represents what God did for us. God's Son physically stepped into the story of everything, taking on the human form Jesus. He took our place and died for us so that we could be restored into our relationship with God. Through the atonement of Jesus dying for us, God denounces sin. But He does so by taking sin's punishment upon Himself. God sent His Son into the world to restore the community that was broken by sin because none of us are able to fully restore this community. None of us can ever be good enough. Only the sacrifice of Jesus is able to restore God's dream for the world and allow us to be part of His family, His community. This is the idea of the atonement. God is for us. Now, finally, we want you to know that the story of Jesus is not just a past tense story. The work of Jesus continues to this day. Jesus is still at work, restoring God's dream for the world, and He invites us to be about that restoration as well. This third idea is the idea that as we look ahead, Jesus will return. And when He does, we will finally see the complete renewal of all things. The implications of this are huge, and we don't want you to miss this part of the story of everything, because this is where your group comes in. As a group, we want you to rejoice about what God has already done through the story of Jesus. We want you to respond to his invitation. And as you follow him, it also means that you get a chance to join God's work in restoring the world and helping others find their way back to God. We do this in groups as we bless each other and as we are sent to bless the world, just like Jesus was. That begins when we understand that God is already at work all around us. So in the next session, we'll talk about the work of the Holy Spirit, and we're excited for you to join us as we continue the story of everything. Have a great small group time.